that's something we all have in common, right? As Latino leaders, we're always looking to educate people. Diego, he's going to introduce himself. He has a huge platform where he, basically one of his main things, the critical thinking. So he'll share a little bit more and go ahead with his question.
Sure. So, Mr. Denny, very, very nice to meet you. And to begin with, let me congratulate you on your bravery. I mean, I normally every week I do live reviewing geopolitical events, and I tend to make a lot of fun of the other two candidates. So you're at least very, very brave to stand up as an independent candidate. Having said that, I have to warn, and my friends, they know me, I tend to do very hard and very tough and very direct questions, but I know you're very much used to them. I've listened to you a lot, and I'm a big fan of the way you express yourself, and you don't have any fears about speaking your mind and speaking truth to power in a way, which is very refreshing, to be honest with you. So having said that, I had some questions. I wish we had more time and a more longer space to have this conversation, but I'm going to try to be as concise and as incisive as I can with the questions. So the first one is that as Latinos, I'm a Brazilian, I'm based in Mexico, so I'm two-language Latino, to say in a way. So we grew up with this idea that the US was like the paragon of democracy. But today, as seeing the type of candidates you can produce and having this two-party system democracy, which is arriving in an ice cream store and choosing between vanilla and chocolate and calling that democracy, which is very much a stretch of the word. And then again, also internally, you don't offer any resemblance of democracy to the everyday people in everyday life. Democracy is having acquisitive power. If people don't have money, they don't have choices, to be honest. So having said that, how do we move forward with this notion? Is it sustainable for the US to keep this paragon of democracy narrative? And if not, what alternatives do we have looking ahead?
Well, I grew up in a milieu where, my father, my uncle, my grandmother, my grandfather thought of America as the template, as you say, the role model, the paradigm for democracy. We were supposed to be the exemplary democracy. When we created a modern American democracy, really in 1789, when we ratified the Bill of Rights and began the American experiment with self-governance, we were the only democracy in the world right then. 1865, there were 5, all of them based on the U.S. model. By 1965, there's 180. Right? So, and we were the model. We had the institution, we had the courts that worked, we had the freedom of the press, we had a very vigorous press that was, as you use the phrase, speaking truth to power, maintaining a posture of fierce skepticism toward government authority. We had institutions that worked, our regulatory agencies, the FDA, people all over the world, all over Latin America would say, hey, if FDA approved that drug, then it's approved in our country, right? And NIH, they were relying on NIH's science and EPA and all of these. And today, U.S. democracy is not a model anymore. And I remember visiting China, for business. I had a lot of green tech businesses back in the early 2000s, and I remember visiting China, and Chinese officials, even the high-level ones, would say to me, we're coming out of an era of extreme poverty and totalitarian rule, and we're transitioning to a democracy, and eventually we're going to have a democracy like you. But in the last 6 or 7 years, if you go to China, nobody's saying that. They say our system is producing. You talk to the governors of these provinces in China, they all have 180 IQs. That is the smartest guy in the province who is running it. And if you talk to U.S. leaders, they're the guys who are like the worst students, and they have a certain set of skills for persuading people to support them, but it doesn't make them good at governing.
Absolutely.
And so I think a lot of the world has lost faith in the democratic model. And for me, the reason for that is because of the money in politics. And particularly after 2008, we passed, the Supreme Court issued this terrible decision called Citizens United. Beginning in 1908, we made it illegal in our country for corporations to donate to federal political candidates. And it saved democracy. We lost democracy in the 1880s and 1890s, the Gilded Age. You had all these robber barons, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Carnegies, the Fricks, all of these guys who were running our country. They were handpicking senators. They were handpicking the presidents. And we lost democracy. We lost it. And then in the early part of the century, you had all of these, you had a confluence event. You had a populist movement in the countryside where farmers were reorganizing to reclaim democracy. You had in the cities what was called the progressive movement, where Republican reformers were appearing. You had a bunch of muckraking journalists, Ida Tarbell, Upton Sinclair, who were writing for this magazine, McClure's, and exposing the corruption of the robber barons of Standard Oil and all this. And you had Teddy Roosevelt, who was a member of the oligarchy, but who wanted to challenge it. And he came along, and at this movement, they created the 40-hour work week. They gave women the vote. They made direct election of senators. Before that, the senators were picked by the legislatures, which were totally corrupt. They were owned by the oil companies and the sugar trust and the rail trust. They banned child labor. They created the income tax for corporations for the first time, and corporate tax. Wealthy people and corporations suddenly had to pay their share of the American experiment. Yeah. But the most important thing they did is in 1908, they passed a law that made it illegal for corporations to donate to federal political candidates. And for 100 years, and we restored democracy. For 100 years, that law stood. And then in 2008, this business-friendly Supreme Court came in and said, no, political contributions are speech. They're protected by the First Amendment, and corporations can give anything they want to a political candidate, and you have the tsunami of money now pouring in. So I'm told that this election is going to cost close to $20 billion. Okay, wow. So if you're a little guy, right, and you can't write a minimum of a $10,000 check, there's nobody in Washington, D.C. who's going to talk to you. Mm-hmm. So, and you see the elites on both sides have zero interest in the American middle class, and all they're doing is moving wealth systematically upward. The BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, in COVID, they shut down all the small businesses in this country. They left open Amazon. They left open Walmart. They shut the bodegas. Right. They shut you saw that, and 41% of Black-owned businesses will never reopen. We shifted $4.3 trillion upward to the oligarchy. And they created, this is Biden and Trump, 500 days, 500 new billionaires. Mm-hmm. So, that's what's become of our country. The only way ultimately to save American democracy is by getting rid of that Citizens United case. And the only way we can do that is with a constitutional amendment. And when I'm president, I'm going to work on making sure that happens, because there's no way we will ever recover if we don't get rid of that.
So it's interesting the way you responded to the question, because we have this running joke in Latin America saying that the U.S. has no corruption because business lobby is legalized. Right. So since business lobby is legalized, there's very little corruption. But I think politicians should wear like their sponsors on their clothes and, like Formula One drivers. So we actually know what's behind them. So I think it's very refreshing the way you respond to this question.
Like automobile racers. They ought to have
like NASCAR. Yeah. So then at least we will know which corporations we're voting for, right? Right. But then as a follow-up question, and seeing this as the real existing capitalism, because we could talk about the theory of capitalism, which is not very interesting to me anymore, but the real existing capitalism that we have in practice, which is this grotesque mix between late-stage capitalism and this very degrading type of democracy that we have at the moment. Don't you see that, or don't you think that in a way regulating the market and setting a very hard difference and differentiating the power between politics and the market itself. It's kind of necessary at the moment, because in a way, when you mention China, and this is one of my main topics of study as an academic in the last few years, is the blooming of the Chinese model in a way. And with the current inability of the American economy to deliver a basic level of dignity to its citizens, do you see like socialism with Chinese characteristics as a viable alternative or something to negotiate with in the future?
No, I mean, I'll tell you what, I'm really huge advocate of free market capitalism, but a free market, we don't have free market capitalism in our country. We have corporate crony capitalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have something close to the Chinese system, which is this corrupt merger of state and corporate power. The function of the state is to protect corporate monopolies, right, and to subsidize them. And they like we have a law in this country that says 27% of federal contracts have to go to small business. Well, this year, I think it was 1%. So we have a law, but they just ignore it, right?
Yeah.
And if you are a small business person, which is what most Hispanics are, right, you get zero advantage from the government.
Yeah.
The government ought to be helping small business, small farmers, and ending these subsidies, the corporate welfare, these giant corporations who already have an advantage because they can get lawyers, and they can get all the loopholes, and they have the lobbyists who are writing new loopholes for them that don't apply to small businesses. And you look what they did to us during COVID. They didn't close any big business. They didn't close Amazon. They didn't close Facebook. They didn't close Google.
Yeah,
they didn't close Walmart, or they closed a little. They closed the corner shop, the nail parlor, who were struggling to make a buck, and just get by. And that's who they went after. So, and the whole system is designed like that. It's not free market capitalism. I want real free market capitalism, which is linked inextricably to democracy. It's local control. It's local economies. It's small farmers, small business people working together. The job of government is to facilitate that, to create transportation, create markets, to create market opportunities for little guys, and to control the domination of big business. I mean, from the beginning of our national history, our greatest political leaders were warning Americans against the emergence against the domination of business by government. Communism is the domination of business by government. Fascism is the domination of government by business. And a free market capitalism, you have to keep big business at bay with your right hand and big government at bay with your left. And walk down this narrow corridor in between, which is free market capitalism and democracy. And you need rules and make sure that the little guys have the opportunity, and that it doesn't all devolve to these big guys. I've watched this my whole life. I'll tell you a story. I was fighting Smithfield Food. Smithfield Food came into North Carolina, purchased built a slaughterhouse for 30,000 animals, 30,000 hogs a day, right? And then it signed contracts with 1,800 small farmers to mass produce hogs in warehouses in ways that are very, very damaging to the environment. At that point, there were 28,000 hog farms in North Carolina, and they were all little guys. They were poor farmers. It was raising hogs is a really easy way to break into a market. But they made it so that you could not sell a hog for slaughter in the state unless you made a deal with them. They dropped the price of hogs from 68 cents a pound to 2 cents a pound. And it cost the farmer 34 cents a pound to raise that hog to kill weight. So they put out of business 28,000 small farmers, and they consolidated. Now you have one corporation that now controls all of the landscapes in the state. It controls all the hog production in the state, the meat production, and then that company sells itself to China. So now you have the Chinese. It's a colonial model. The Chinese now control the landscapes of North Carolina and the people. Now, Smithfield then went to Europe and tried to do the same thing there. It was going to start with Poland. And I went and testified in front of the Polish parliament. And they had passed a law in Poland, Smithfield Foods. They bribed a legislature named Andre Lepper, $1 million they gave him to pass a law. In Poland, there were all the farms were organic, because in the Soviet era, they couldn't afford chemicals. So they have these beautiful farms. Each one has like a cow, a bunch of chickens, and each little town has an abattoir, a little slaughterhouse, where they make kielbasa, Polish sausage, the best sausage in the world. So Smithfield came in and built a big slaughterhouse, one of the old Soviet slaughterhouses. It took over, and it passed a law that said you cannot operate a slaughterhouse in Poland unless you have laser triggers on the faucets in your bathroom. Well, you know, when you go to the airport and you just wave your hand in front of the faucet.
Yeah.
And it goes. So they said, this is for hygiene. This is, well, we care about hygiene. You don't want them touching the faucet. It wasn't hygiene. They didn't care about hygiene. They didn't have any hygiene problems with these little abattoirs. They knew that those things would cost thousands of dollars, and no small slaughterhouse could afford them. So they put out of business every slaughterhouse in Poland except for theirs.
Well, that's similar to like the fight for 15, right? Amazon loves the fight for 15 because they can afford to pay everybody $15 an hour and everyone else can't.
Exactly.
So at this stage in the game, you know, when Jeff Bezos was in his garage, he wouldn't have liked the $15 hour minimum wage because he wouldn't have been able to grow to the scale that he is. But now that Walmart and Amazon are the big boys in town, they can afford to pay a higher minimum wage, so they don't mind. What looks like something that they're doing to be altruistic is actually something that they're doing to trample competition. Another thing that I just wanted to mention, you know, it's kind of a misconception that the United States is a democracy, is a pure democracy. We're supposed to be a democratic republic where each state is supposed to have its own sovereignty. And that's supposed to be part of the check and balance system of this American experiment of democracy, where you have this democratic republic. Each state has its own sovereignty. And if you don't like what's happening in one state, you can move to another. But as the federal government has grown larger and larger and larger, right? We were talking about the Federal Bureau of Prisons. There was no such thing as a federal prison system. There was no such thing as federal police. When the federal police started, they had to hide in the post office and pretend that they were postal employees and postal inspectors because there was not supposed to be a federal police force. The federal government was supposed to be very small. So as we're moving into a new world where the federal system is so huge and bloated and it is manipulating and controlling the states, I would love to hear your thoughts, Kennedy, on how we can make the federal government smaller.
Well, I mean, look, right now there's a lot of innovative ways to make it smaller. My passion would be to make the government efficient, to make it do what it's supposed to do. Like NIH is supposed to protect public health. I wouldn't shrink NIH, but I'd stop NIH from being an incubator for pharmaceutical products and just, you know, making new pharmaceutical products for the industry all the time and then collecting royalties on that. NIH should be telling us, why do we have the highest diabetes rate in the world? Why do we have the highest autism rate in the world? why are our kids the sickest in the world? So why isn't anybody telling us that? When my uncle was president, 6% of American kids had chronic disease. Today, it's 60%. When I was a kid, the average pediatrician saw one case of diabetes in his lifetime over a 40-year career. Today, one out of every 3 kids who walks through his office door has diabetes. Something happened. What is it? Why isn't NIH telling us? Why are our kids obese? You know, we went from 13% to almost 50%. Why? If they didn't get lazy all of a sudden, they're being mass poisoned. The autism rate in my generation, 70-year-old men, is 1 in 10,000. Mm-hmm. In my kids' generations, 1 in every 34 kids. Yep. What happened? This is what NIH should be doing. It shouldn't be developing new drugs to treat all these diseases and cash in on them. Right. It should be with pharma. It should be telling us why it's happening and then ending it. Oh, there's all kinds of opportunities. For example, I'll tell you, I the other day I was talking to an expert on AI in the military, and we were talking about the fact that the Pentagon audit, the 20th year in a row, the Pentagon failed its audit. They lost $4.2 trillion. They can't find it. Nobody knows where it is. Okay. So they said most of that money is from stuff that they bought, inventory they bought, and then they can't find where it is. So they have to buy another one, right? And it's in stockpiles somewhere in some state, and nobody knows where to find it. And they lost $4.3 trillion. How can you lose $1 million, much less $1 billion, much less 4.3 trillion? Yeah. That's lost. And this AI guy was saying, look, it's very easy. You get AI walkers to go through all the stockpiles and find out where everything is. And then, and you can eliminate huge amounts of waste now using AI. I would do that. There's some agencies of government that I don't think are functioning. I think the Department of Education is a crime, right? And I think there's parts of the Department of Education I would try to save. Mm-hmm. The record keeping, the analytics, the research functions of the Department of Education. But in terms of promoting the core curriculum and promoting all of this other stuff that they're doing, it's a complete waste of time, and it's failed. Let's admit it's failed, and let's do something else. So I wouldn't just say go in and cut the entire federal government. And by the way, I'll tell you something. The state, as corrupt as the federal government is, the states are more corrupt, and they're more susceptible to corporate influence. The corporations love it when you get rid of federal powers because they can easily dominate the state political landscapes, and they go into those states and it's a race to bottom. Oh, I don't think it's a solution simply to get rid of the federal. The solution is to make the thing work the way it's supposed to work, right? And not just be a mechanism for enriching corporations. And, our agencies used to be really the best in the world, gold standard. They're now sock puppets for the industries they're supposed to regulate. They're wholly owned subsidiaries of those industries. The FCC is run by Verizon. The DOT is run by Norfolk Southern and, the airline companies. The EPA is run by the coal and oil and chemical companies. USDA is completely run by big ag and by processed food industry. And they were created to preserve the small farmer and give us wholesome food. Their actual function is to poison us and to kill off the small farmer. Mm-hmm. And so, the health agencies have nothing to do with public health. They all have. Their job is to promote profits, the mercantile interests of the pharmaceutical industry. So, I don't. It's not just cutting. You can't just go in there and cut. You got to go in there and change the culture. And I know how to do that because I've been suing these agencies for 40 years. I've sued all of them. And when you sue them, you get a PhD in how to unravel corporate capture.
Right.
So, having understand that, I mean, I share the diagnosis of saying that most of these, nefarious outcomes that we see, especially in health, and I can very much relate to what you said regarding autism, because one of my children is in the spectrum. Even if that's not necessarily a diagnosis, you can dig deeper and go genetically, and you will understand much more about the cases. But it's true that our generation was not so exposed to that hazard, and now is pretty much very common, widespread. But what I fail to understand, Mr. Kennedy, and I would like you to elaborate if you can, is how do you propose to solve these problems of these big nefarious corporations exerting their influence in federal government and even state government to further their economical interest with more free market? How is more free market a solution to this?
Well, number one, we got to get rid of the Citizens United because that is a systemic, corruption. That's like you said.
Right. It
has legalized bribery on a massive scale. So, I love what you said about that. But within each of these agencies, there are two things happening. One is you have corrupt personnel who have, infiltrated the culture with their corruption. And two, you have perverse incentives, which need to be changed because, for example, FDA gets 50% of its budget from the pharmaceutical companies.
Correct.
So they're not working for us. Working for
we're not the boss.
Yeah. What would happen? EPA is a captive agency. It's captive by oil and coal. What would happen if EPA was getting 50% of its budget from the coal companies and it only got that budget if they did well selling coal every year? Yeah, well, that's how FDA works. NIH, we changed the law in 1980. This is the craziest thing. You wouldn't believe how crazy this is. We passed an act called the Bayh-Dole Act in 1980. And it said that any scientist who's working for NIH gets to collect royalties on any drug that he regulated. So with the Moderna vaccine, I'll just give you one example. The Moderna vaccine, which has a kill rate 40% greater than any of the other vaccines. It was the worst of all of them. The Moderna vaccine was developed by NIH, and so NIH owns 50%, and half the royalties go to NIH, so it's making tens of billions of dollars. There's 6 individuals who work at NIH, high-level deputies, who make $150,000 a year forever. As long as mRNA products are on the market, those 6 guys are making money. These are the guys whose job it is to find problems with that product, to say, hey, wait a minute, it's not safe enough here, you can't do this, you can't do that. But they are paying for their mortgages. They're paying for their boat. They're paying for their kids' education. Yeah. They're paying for their alimonies. Yeah. So,
the whole incentive system is rigged.
Yeah, it's a perverse incentive, and it's going to put agency capture on steroids. And then the other thing is personnel. Policy is personnel. Okay. When I sued Monsanto, we got discovery documents, which were emails from the top officials at the Monsanto company and the head of the pesticide division at EPA. His name was Jess Rowland. And as it turns out, he was running the pesticide division for a decade, but he wasn't really working for EPA. He was secretly working for Monsanto the whole time, and they were telling him, you got to kill this study, you got to fix this study, you got to bring in these mercenary scientists that we're going to give you to sign on to this study, and we're going to ghostwrite it for you. Yeah. And he was doing everything they said. At one point, they said to him, there's another agency outside of EPA. It's called Agency for Toxic Substances Research, the ATSDR. They're doing an article, they're doing a study studying the links between cancer and Roundup. You can't let them do that because we know what they're going to say, what they're going to find, and we can't let them publish it. And Jess Rowland said, that's not my agency. I can't do anything about it. This is what he wrote. And they wrote him back saying, you got to do it. So finally he writes back and says, okay, but if I do this, you better give me a gold medal. So we had that correspondence in the case. We had 40,000 cases. And in multi-district litigation, you try the cases one at a time until somebody comes and says, uncle, I give up. The first case, we won $289 million. On the second case, we won $89 million. But in those two, the judges would not let us show that document to the jury. The third case, they let us show it to the jury. And we asked for $1 billion. They gave us $2.2 billion. And then Monsanto came to the table and we settled all the cases. But what Jess Rowland, there's guys like that in every agency. And in many of the cases, I know who they are, I know their names, and I got to move them out.
Yeah. Deng Xiaoping used to say that the market it's a horrible master, but an excellent slave. So exactly. We have to change that. And I saved the last two more, the toughest two questions to end. And again, thank you so much for the time, Mr. Kennedy. So the first one is, I've been researching a lot what's been happening in China for the last few decades with a lot of admiration and curiosity. And I think we have a lot to learn about their experiment, even understanding that their conditions are very unique and very different from ours in this side of the world. But having said that, one of the data that I came across, and I wanted to ask you about this, because it has to do with the deindustrialization of the American economy and the over-financiarization of the American economy, the dependence on investment economy instead of productive economy. At the moment, the data is that out of every $100 that are issued by the Federal Reserve, only 24 of those dollars are actually used to produce commodities, into the production cycle. The other 76 are into speculation mostly. In China, the data is out of every $100 emitted by the central banking system, 97 are used for production. So what's your point of view regarding how to make America productive and competitive again without over-depending on this investment and speculation that is becoming more and more dangerous in the multipolar world that is emerging?
Yeah, I mean, you bring up the central point, and the sort of the big issue here is the role of the Fed, right? Mm-hmm. And the role of the Fed has been to deindustrialize the American economy and financialize it, and because the Fed is a captive agency, and it's captive by the big banks, and by Wall Street interests. And they use this cycle of quantitative easing followed by high interest rates to lure. It's like a trap. It's like setting a trap, right? They bait the trap with the quantitative easing, which is, easy money, and everybody runs into the trap, and then they raise the interest rates. Everybody goes bankrupt. The equity becomes available, and J.P. Morgan and BlackRock and State Street purchase the equity, and this is there's been this system for shifting wealth upward. Beginning with really most dramatically with the 2008 housing crisis. Right? Nobody got punished. Nobody went to jail. The people and the people who got bailed out were the banks rather than the customers. They lost their property, and the banks ended up owning everything. The people who had created the crisis ended up profiting from it. But and we have now exported our industrial base to China, and there's also a connection between the Fed's ability just to print as much money as it can and the war machine. The only way, first of all, you can't make war unless you have fiat currency, unless you're printing money. That's how they finance
troops and buy arsenals.
Yeah, and then the way that we keep America as the world's reserve currency, the American dollar, is through our military power, 800 bases abroad.
Yeah.
And so the world is, other countries are buying the American dollar as the reserve currency, as the trade currency, as the safe haven currency. They're essentially financing our debt so that we don't experience inflation. If they stop doing that, our inflation is going through the roof and we're dead.
Yeah.
So I'll tell you another problem with this, and we're seeing it now in Ukraine, is that America does not have the capacity to fight a war anymore, because we were the arsenal of democracy in World War II. Why? Because we had a huge industrial base.
Correct.
And we took all of the automobile companies and we converted them to military production. They built tanks, they built planes, 56 planes a month or whatever. They are building huge numbers. And we could do that then. And we still think of ourselves as the arsenal of democracy, but we aren't. The Chinese are. The Chinese can fight a war. There's one Chinese company that makes 75% of the drones on Earth. They have the ability to fight a world war. We have no ability. And, we're figuring out that now. We can't get, these ultrasonic weapons that the Chinese and Russian have. We couldn't get 1 million troops across the Atlantic anyway. We can't supply them. The Russians have better weapons than us. They have 1,500 more nuclear warheads than we do. They have better defensive weapons. They're obliterating our weaponry. We make weapons. Our weapons are not designed to fight a war. They're designed to enrich. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics. They're over-engineered. They're overpriced. The stealth bomber costs like $1.5 billion. It can't fly in the rain. Okay, it can't. And the Chinese and Russian defense systems can shoot it down now.
Yeah.
It was useless, but that's the kind of stuff that we're creating. This very sophisticated engineering. The Russians are much more simple. Their engineering is exquisite. And they don't have the capacity for mass production, but the Chinese do. You put Russian engineering, you marry that to Chinese mass production, and we are going to get obliterated in the war. And nobody.
Mr. Kennedy, there's a question from the audience that speaks on this. There's a question from the audience that speaks on this from Maria. She was asking, we're talking about all these domestic issues, but internationally, one of her biggest fears for her family is World War III. So what steps would you take to de-escalate World War III? That seems to be looming.
I would settle the war in Ukraine overnight. We should never have been fighting that war. Mm-hmm. Putin has repeatedly tried to settle it on terms very, very beneficial to our country and to Ukraine. By the way, my son fought in that war. Wow. He fought in the Kharkiv offensive, and he went and, he joined the Foreign Legion. I have sympathy for the Ukrainian people. We are destroying the Ukrainian people. We've killed, there's maybe 1.1 million people. I know that 600,000, the best numbers that I've seen are 600,000 troops killed. They're now drafting teenagers. They're drafting 60-year-old men. They're drafting women. And the Russians are killing Ukrainians apparently at a rate about 6 to 1. And there are Ukrainians now there are units that are refusing to go, refusing orders to fight. The war is over. Ukraine is about to collapse. And, our government is still telling us that we're winning. And our press is still lying to us like they've been lying to us from day one. And the problem is you have people in this White House who are trying to save face, who do not want to come to terms with the fact that, with the realization that they have been lying to us from the beginning. And they have no fear of nuclear exchange. And the Russians have 1,000 to 1,500 more nuclear weapons than we do. They have better defensive weapons. The latest Pentagon report says that if we were to get into a nuclear exchange with the Russians, we would lose 90 million Americans dead in the first 24 hours and another 90 million over the next 6 months.
What?
And,
So half the population.
these guys, Tony Blinken, who's running our government? Who do you guys say is running our government? You think that President Biden is making these decisions?
Absolutely not. There's
I don't think
Yeah, military contractors. Yeah.
it's anonymous men in lanyards. You know,
Yeah.
So, guys, we want to.
Somebody has their feet.
It's a joke.
Before we go, we want to make sure to touch on an immigration. That's a very sensitive subject to our Latino community. I'm on a board, it's called Justice for All, with a former ICE director, not because I'm against immigration, right? But because I'm against what's happening at the border right now, the open borders. Most of us who move to the United States come here because we want to leave behind all the crime and we want to feel more safe. And it doesn't make any sense what's going on right now, that these people are being incentivized, right, to do what they're doing. So how can we transform that border crisis into some kind of opportunity, right? Because I always say that in every crisis, there has to be the other side, the transformation side, the breakthrough, the opportunity.
Yeah. I mean, I want to recount this, that my father was very close to Cesar Chavez. Right. And Cesar Chavez really helped to live in the state of California for my father in 1968, the last day of his life. He was his closest political ally. They were very much aligned. They were very similar. They were very stoic characters. They were shorter in stature. My father was, unlike his brothers who were all over 6 feet, he was 5'10", but he was, they were both very tough. They both loved St. Francis of Assisi. They were both very pious Catholics, and they hit it off with each other. And then my father was killed in '68 on the day that he won the California primary, thanks to Cesar Chavez. I worked with Cesar Chavez in 1980 on my uncle's campaign, and he won us the state of Arizona by sending lowriders and organizers into the precincts and getting out the vote. And then during the last years of his life, from like 83 to 93, the last decade, I worked very closely with Cesar Chavez on pesticide issues, because there's 56,000 Hispanic farm workers who are poisoned by pesticides every year. Their families are devastated by exposure to these pesticides in the home. Cesar Chavez and I, because of my closeness to him, the family asked me to be one of the pallbearers in his funeral. But the other issue that he had at that time was pesticides was one issue. The other issue was immigration, because to shut down the border, because he saw that this wave of immigrants that was coming over the border were hurting his ability to get good wages and conditions for his workers. A lot of Democrats now say, "Oh, it's compassionate, humanitarian to open the border." It isn't. I've been down to that border repeatedly. I watched people. First of all, my first trip down there, I watched 300 people come across between 2 o'clock at Yuma. This was between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning. And only 2 of them were from Latin America. It was one Colombian family and one Peruvian. And they both had asylum claims. Everybody else, the first 110 people who came across were from West Africa, young men, military age. The other ones, the second group was 110 people from Asia, from Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Nepal, Tibet, Bangladesh, India, mainly from China. They answered advertising that the Sinaloa drug cartel had put on TikTok and YouTube, saying, "Send us $10,000 and we'll get you across." And they knew every step of the way. And they come through. They're put on an airplane by the Border Patrol from Yuma to any place they want, and they're arriving in New York, 110,000, crushing the social safety net, so that Hispanics who live in the city are not able to access social services and hospital services. All this, they're overwhelming our country. It's not humanitarian. Then they go to New York. They're given an asylum court date 7 years in the future, and they can't legally work, so they're being taken advantage of by predatory employers who pay them 6, 10, 12 bucks an hour, and that construction company that's hiring them is bidding against union shops in New York. So the union workers who actually would be bringing money in and supporting families can't get to work. It hurts everybody. And, what we need in this country is we need wide gates so that people who do come across have a fast path to citizenship. So there's 10 million small businesses in this country that need workers from abroad. We need to get them workers, but they need to come across legally. We should not let the drug cartels be running U.S. border policy. And it's terrible, and we're not getting the people that we want and that we need and that are going to be beneficial to this country. And what I will do, I'll shut down the border overnight. And the way that I'll do it, with 3 ways. One, I'll complete the 27 gaps in the wall that need to be seeded. You don't need a wall all the way 2,200 miles from Brownsville, Texas to San Diego. But you do need it in the urban areas where people can come across and quickly disappear. I'll fix the infrastructure in the rural areas, the fences, the long-range cameras, the sensors. Israel has a system, and until October 7th, nobody can get across. It's a fence. But it has great sensors, it has cameras, it has long-range cameras, it has night lights, and nobody gets across. And then, so you do with the infrastructure, we need to hire about 2,600 new border patrol. We need to have 300 asylum court judges on the border adjudicating asylum claims immediately. And then we need to re-effect 2 laws. One is the catch and release program should be changed to catch and return like it was before. And the Migrant Protection Act should be reinstated so that people who come to Mexico with an asylum claim to get into the United States, they adjudicate their claims in Mexico before they come across the border. And then I have other issues too to solve it, but I don't want to go into too much detail and bore people to death. But it's something that I'm determined to take care of.
Yes, that's something, like I said, it's a very sensitive subject for our community. So Tony's going to hop off now. So for the last question, we're going to give to Simon. He was having connection issues, but he said he fixed them. So we'll let you do that so I can add him very quickly. I know we only have a few minutes left because I'm getting messages. So I'm aware we're tight on time. So don't worry. This will be the closing. Okay. And we'll all be very concise. So just, Tony, if you can hop off for me so I can bring on Simon and we can do the closing together. He was...
Can I ask a question in the meantime while you add this?
Sure. Yeah. Okay, but concise.
So,
yeah.
Thank you again, Mr. Kennedy, and thank you, Diego.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed being with you.
So, Mr. Kennedy, well, we had Simon back, and I'm really sorry because Simon is a very good friend of mine. I'm sure he will be a lovely addition to the conversation. I just wanted to follow up on this question, and it's a very sensitive topic for us, Latin Americans. Simon is back, awesome. So it's a very sensitive topic for us, Latin Americans, in our relationship with the U.S. because it's true that a lot of people tend to go to the U.S. with this notion of the American dream, right? To make it big, to chase their dreams and whatnot. But then again, when we leave our countries in Latin America, it's kind of hard to avoid the fact that there has been historically a lot of meddling from the U.S. into Latin America. And I don't have to name the list. I'm sure you know it by heart. The list is very, very long. So what's your currently standing political position or for example, on the non-unilateral sanctions in Cuba and Venezuela, for example, and how these sanctions produce immigration into the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, I would lift the sanctions on Cuba. I think that's an atrocity. It's been there. I met with Castro many times, and he as much as admitted to me that the embargo had kept him in power. It was the best thing that ever happened to him. It had the opposite effect. He was the longest reigning dictator in the world. And it was largely because he could point to all of the problems that he had in Cuba. He could point to the United States and say, oh, it's their embargo. They're doing it to us. And, we need national security. I would lift the embargo in Cuba. The United States, my uncle felt, started the Alliance for Progress. He started USAID because U.S. policy up until his administration was just the only issue was anti-communism. As long as there was a dictator who said he hated communists, we would help that guy. We would help the military. We would help the oligarchs because they hated the communists. And my father and uncle said, that's not a good policy. We need to offer the poor in these countries a path to the middle class. And so they created USAID. At that time, before the CIA front, it was designed to run the oligarchs and give aid directly to the poor, the kind of aid that would move them into the middle class. The same with the Alliance for Progress. My uncle thought it was wrong for the CIA to be meddling in these countries, and I will put an end to that. These countries need to determine their own path, their own sovereignty, and we need to figure out a way to work with them, no matter what it is. So, I don't think I would end the belligerence. And look, you look at Central America, and what the richest country in Central America is Costa Rica. Costa Rica is the only country we've never invaded. It's the only country, it doesn't have an army. It's peaceful, it's wealthy, it's happy. You look at the countries where we've had a presence. Guatemala never recovered from us overthrowing Jacobo Arbenz in 1953. Salvador's never recovered from us funding the death squads there, right? And now Salvador is with Bukele, and it looks like they may be transitioning out, but we need to be partners with these countries. They want our leadership. They don't want our bullying. And I'm going to end the era of American bullying and have a real partnership with Latin America. I've been to every country in Latin America. I worked from high school. I worked every year in Colombia. In the summers, I lived in Peru and the Altiplano in Peru. My uncle's favorite trip to Latin America, just before his death, he visited Colombia. Or this was his favorite. There was two trips that he had that he said were the best trips of his administration. One was back to Ireland, which naturally was, an incredible trip for him. The other trip was to Colombia, and he met Yedis Camargo, who was the greatest statesman that he met. He and Jackie both said the single greatest statesman they met during their terms in office. And they met de Gaulle, they met Eamon de Valera, who was the George Washington of Colombia, and they met the greatest. They met Haile Selassie in Ethiopia, all these extraordinary leaders, the Shah of Iran, whatever. They said of all the leaders they met, Yedis Camargo was the most brilliant and the most gifted. And there was 1 million people in the principal plaza in Bogota, and that came out to see my uncle. And they were cheering wildly for him. And Yedis Camargo said to him, "Do you know why they love you?" And my uncle said no, and he said, because they think that you put America on the side of the poor, right? Mm-hmm. And, that's what my uncle tried to do, to not have wars. And because of that, and to put America on the side of the poor, building the middle class, because of that, there's more statues to John Kennedy in Latin America, more boulevards named after him, more parks and universities and hospitals in Latin America, Africa, and Asia than any other president, probably more than all the presidents put together. And it's because put America on the side of the poor, and that's what we need to be doing again.
So, Mr. Kennedy,
I'm getting messages.
I'm gonna say goodbye because I have to leave. My kids are waiting for me Sunday. I have to help them with work, with homework for tomorrow. But then again, I'm willing to offer you. I have a huge following in Latin America. I would love to have a follow-up on this conversation. I can get in touch with Gabby if it's possible. And just as a curious fact, I went to a high school in Mexico that was the John Kennedy High School.
Wow. Oh my God. What a fun fact. Thank you so much, Diego, for your participation. I know many messages from